Thanks, Giannis. I have to say it's been really exciting being involved in this group, and it's thanks to Yishai for setting it up and getting the funding from the Stellar network. Those of us who've been working in learning design have touched base in a number of spaces over the years, but this network has really enabled us to start to consolidate the area quite extensively. And we're thinking we're at a really exciting point, so we want to share that with you today. Can I ask how many of you in the audience are involved in learning design specifically? Okay, so quite a few. So some of you will be here to compare what you're doing with what we're doing. Others will be kind of trying to get an overview. So I'm just going to give you a kind of, if you like, the big picture of where the area is. And the aspects I'm going to talk about are, I think, at the heart of the work we're doing is the issue about the challenge in terms of the changing context of education. And in particular, the paradoxes raised by technologies. Despite the fact that we've got an amazing set of technologies now available to us, free resources, indeed even free courses, and lots of open educational resources, really funded and led by people like UNESCO and the Hewlett Foundation, these things are not being used extensively in education. They're not being used extensively by practitioners. And so at the heart of what we're trying to do is produce a set of conceptual ideas and tools to help practitioners make informed decisions about use of technologies which are pedagogically effective. I'm then going to look briefly at the broader notion of design practices and how this work of learning design, which has emerged as a field in the last 10 years or so, sits alongside related design activities in other disciplines. And then I'm going to give you a quick feel for some of the learning design stuff, which acts as a prelude, if you like, to the later presentations in the morning in terms of the patterns and the tools that we're going to present, and then to the kind of active workshop part in the afternoon. So as I said, there are a number of paradoxes raised by technologies. There are lots and lots of great technologies out there, but they're not being fully exploited, and there's little evidence of the use of free resources. So there's been a huge growth in the open educational resource movement in the last 10 years. Lots and lots of fantastic high-quality OER repositories. And I think there was a naive assumption initially that if we make these resources available, people will use them, and they don't. And lots of evaluation has worked on that. The Open University UK, for example, has a repository called OpenLearn, and that's been extensively evaluated, and these things are not being extensively used by teachers and learners, and they're certainly not being repurposed. So what are the issues? We've done quite a lot of work at talking to teachers and interviewing them and asking, well, why aren't you using them? What would help you use things more? And there are lots and lots of very good reasons: technical, pedagogical, organisational. And they also cite, not surprisingly, things like lack of time, tension between research and teaching. Any of you who work in research-intensive institutions will know that the drive for promotion is research and funding, not teaching innovation. And that's a real barrier. They lack skills, there's no reward, there's no support, and the list goes on and on. And we put forward, there are a number of kind of solutions, if you like, to this, but in particular, we're interested in this new approach in terms of a whole set of tools and resources around designing for learning. So let's look more broadly at design practice. Any of you who've been to Spain will recognise this building as a fantastic arts and science complex in Valencia. And I think it's a beautiful example of kind of architectural vision put into practice. So we know that there's design practice in other areas, and a number of things about that. We know that the design language is generally about communicating information and ideas in some way, and to have some kind of shared understanding of what the design is. Clearly, in terms of going from an architect's initial vision for a building to the building itself, there's a number of key design steps and decisions that need to be gone through. So design languages for the literature are about communicating design plans and intentions. And design, Winograd argues that there are a number of steps to design as a conscious process, making things much more explicit, and that's a very important part of our learning design work, because traditionally teachers' design practice is implicit and in their heads, and what we want to do is make it much more explicit and hence shareable. It's about dialogue with the materials, it's about creative process, it's about communication, and it's about social activity. So all of those which Winograd talks about in terms of general design are very true in a learning design context. And design languages help to generate designs and help to have a shared vocabulary and a means of interpreting and discussing. A couple of years ago, Giannis and I ran some workshops in the UK where we got people to sit down in pairs to say, okay, you two, try and share a design, an idea. So it's in your head, and actually people found it very hard just verbally to explain what the nature of the design was. So design is a complex process, and just verbal representations, we argue, are not enough. And we think there's a huge potential, and this is evident, I think, across all of the tools in terms of the power of visualization. So let's look at some design in other areas. If we look at music, for example, music notation, actually that stable music notation is a relatively recent phenomenon. And of course, the music representation actually captures a whole load of stuff, not only which notes to press at which points and which tempo, but also conveys some of the emotion inherent in the music. Now, before musical notation was evident, essentially it had to be replicated from person to person, and of course there was a loss of fidelity along the way. So having accurate representations are very important, and it took a long time for music to get to the stable stage. So it's not surprising that we're having so much difficulty in an educational context in terms of articulating and locking down educational design. Another area, so I talked about architecture and music. A third area where you could argue design notation is very important is in the area of chemistry, where you've got the atoms as the equivalent to the alphabet, the molecules or words. And there's a whole range of different 2D and 3D representations that chemists use in different ways, which is really important. So what about design in education? Okay, so I said we interviewed teachers and we asked them a number of things. We asked them firstly about their design process. How do they go about design? We asked them where do they get ideas from. So when they're starting design, where do they get ideas and inspiration? What kind of support, if any, they had? How they shared or did they share their designs with others? And what, if any, evaluation did they do in terms of how effective their designs were? And that gave us a really rich picture of the nature of design and how teachers were currently going about it. Findings. Not surprisingly, we found that it was actually very difficult for teachers to accurately represent designs. It wasn't systematic. Design was a messy, creative, iterative process. How many of you are teachers or have been involved in designing learning interventions? And would you agree it's a messy, creative process? I think it certainly is. You know, sometimes when you're designing, you're thinking about the resources or tools. Other times you're thinking about the learning outcomes. Other times you're thinking about the nature of the students. And you oscillate between these different aspects of the design at different different points in the process. But predominantly, a lot of the ways in which teachers go about design is content focused. And we wanted to move it to be much more activity focused and about what the student experience would be, or the learner experience. So we also came up with a wish list, and when we asked teachers what would make a difference to them in terms of using technologies, they said, give me examples of good practice, preferably in my subject discipline. What are other nurse practitioners doing? How are other chemists using problem-based learning? How are people using wikis in computer science? And also give me people to talk to, so I can follow things on.
Because what kind of teachers did you?
Higher education.
Higher education.
Yeah. But in a related project with Cyprus, Simas Petros' boss, and with Cyprus and Greece, we translated that to the secondary school sector as well. And actually the issues are similar. Okay, you don't have the tension between research and teaching, but a lot of the kind of inherent issues I'm raising here are very similar. We didn't, interestingly, look at the corporate world, and I know some of you mentioned you're from the corporate world, and that would be interesting to look at in terms of whether there are any differences. I suspect not too much. I think the core issues are the same. Where's your background from?
I work with a lot of history and citizenship teachers in secondary.
Okay. Okay. All right. Great. Thanks. us a really rich picture of what's going on and what some of the issues were as a starting point to say, well, what can we do to help teachers make more use of technologies? And essentially, individually, in ad hoc ways over the last 10 years or so, I think together we've been collectively coming towards a new learning design methodology. And I would define this as a research-based design approach to the creation and support of courses. Now when I say courses, I mean that very loosely. It could be loose learning activities, it could be a whole formal course, it could be informal learning, but to the creation of learning interventions of some kind. And we believe that helps to shift teachers away from, and again I should use perhaps the word practitioners because they may be trainers and others involved in education of some kind, from this kind of belief-based implicit approach to design in their heads to one that's much more design-based and rigorous and explicit. And for example, some of the pedagogical patterns we're going to show you later are essentially abstracts of good practice, which is grounded in empirical evidence and give you a kind of structure of a good practice in some way, which you can adapt. And we think this is encourages reflective scholarly practice and helps promote sharing and discussing. Remember, teachers said, give me examples, give me people I can talk to. So this is kind of inherent in the approach we went about. So a definition, a bit of a long definition, but I think it captures what the nature of the term is. So learning design, we would argue, is a method for enabling teachers or designers to make more informed decisions in how they go about designing learning activities and interventions, which is pedagogically informed and makes effective use of appropriate resources and technologies. This includes the design of resources and individual learning activities right up to whole curriculum level design. And a key principle is to help make the design process more explicit and shareable. And as an area of research and development, it includes both gathering empirical evidence, such as those interviews with teachers. We've also run now hundreds and hundreds of workshops, and just as we will be today, we're evaluating how effective those workshops are, what people like and do, what works, what doesn't. As well, and that helps us to continually better understand the design process, and also feeds into the development of the various tools, resources and activities we've got, some of which we're going to show you today and you're going to have a chance to play with. So, to kind of summarise the field, I've recently submitted a book to Springer. At the end, if you're interested, I've got chapters available on Dropbox. If you want access to the chapters, you're really welcome. And so I'll just give you an overview of that, because I think that fleshes out a little bit more the nature of the field, and it will point you to some of the key theoretical underpinnings of our work, and also to relevant resources. And as Ishai said, the LD Grid website also has an evolving set of our collective resources. So this was work initially based when I was at the Open University, and the book is divided into a number of sections. First, it draws and articulates the theory and methodology we're drawing on. I mentioned design-based research is very much key to what we're doing, and it's very much a socio-cultural approach. Any of you here from North America? I think some people were. Were some people from North America? No? No one from North America? Okay, it's interesting, when I go to the States, they always say, isn't learning design just instructional design? And it's not. It comes from quite a different background and it's got quite a different purpose, but it is complementary to it. So the second section looks at related fields and articulates a relationship between the work we're doing in learning design and instructional design, pedagogical patterns, open educational resources, etc. Then there's a review of new and emergent technologies, in particular social and participatory media, and a map to how they can be used to promote different kinds of new e-pedagogies. And then underpinning the work that we're doing, there are two key concepts: the notion of mediating artifacts, the notion that if you and I are talking about a design, we have some shared artifact that we discuss and share between, and whether that's a verbal representation or an artifact of some time, a visualization. These mediating artifacts are very important, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a second. And the second is the notion that technologies have affordances attached to them. So, and we co-evolve with those affordances, and I'll come back to talk about about that in a second. Then there's a whole section on the design representations we've developed collectively in the tools, and that's particularly what we're going to focus on in the session today. There's a section on the nature of openness, what adopting more open approaches and practices in learning, teaching and research might mean, and in particular the work around open educational resources. And finally, the fact that we're now seeing new communities and interactions in these online spaces and the implications of that for how we change our scholarly practice. So the notion of affordances goes back to an ecological perspective by Gibson in the 70s, and he argued that all action possibilities latent in the environment but always in relation to the actor and therefore dependent on their capabilities. For instance, a tall tree offers the affordance of food for a giraffe but not for a sheep. So we've adapted that because we think that really nicely articulates the relationship between tools and practices. Now, I have to say, the notion of affordances is controversial. Not everybody agrees with it, so that might be a bar conversation later. So we can see that technologies have a set of affordances. So, for example, discussion forums, people often say they have an affordance of reflection. Things like Second Life potentially have affordances of authentic learning environments. Or they might be that they offer interactivity, communication, etc. So there's a set of latent affordances within the technologies themselves. But we as users don't come as blank canvases to those technologies. So each user has a set of preferences, skills, interests, and the context in terms of where they are. Now, to give an example of this, how many of you are on Facebook? How many of you hate Facebook? Why? Not to pick on you, but why? You don't know.
Intrusion.
Intrusion, okay. It's any technology you could take. Again, Twitter, how many on Twitter? How many hate Twitter? Why? Okay. And you don't want to say what you had for breakfast? Yeah. Okay, so, and people have very strong views. Now, I see that really strongly in my two girls. The elder one uses her laptop as a complete academic tool. Very good with it, very good at searching, finding, using information. She hates Facebook. She thinks it's the work of the devil. She gets really cross if she finds out I've sneaked up a picture of her or a picture of her art. The younger one loves Facebook, is on it all the time, is always kind of communicating with people, has already got 300 friends, even though she's only been on it a few months. So we have very strong views about these technologies, and so there's an interrelationship between the two things which is not simple, and that's why I think the concept of affordances is so useful. And also we evolve with these. How many of you took a while to get used to Twitter? So each of us need to have our own aha moment in terms of these technologies. I'm struggling at the moment, for example, with Google+. I'm not quite there with it, but you know, we each have to kind of co-evolve over time with these technologies. So I'm just going to also talk about the concept of mediating artifacts. It goes right back to the work of Vygotsky and the cultural historical activity theory work of Engelstrom and others. And to represent this, I would argue conceptually that a teacher, when they create a learning activity or resource, that learning activity or resource has an inherent design. Whether that design is explicit or not, it has a design of some kind. And we would argue that what we need to do is make these designs more explicit in some ways. Now, how do they go about creating those? They use a range of mediating artifacts. They might look on the web, they might talk to another teacher and find out how they've been using a wiki. They might use some guidelines or some of the tools that we'll be describing to you today. All of these, we would argue, are mediating artifacts. So a teacher creates a design and an activity using a range of mediating artifacts. And we argue that if we make the design more explicit, then other teachers and learners can more easily use or repurpose that. And again, in the workshop Janus and I did a couple of years ago, we found that evidence that was valuable, although it wasn't conclusive. And our interest in terms of questions are what mediating artifacts do teachers use and what can we create to guide the design process. And we're going to be showing you some examples of the ones that we've developed. So how do we go about making design explicit? In the OU work, we've developed 5 visual conceptual design tools which I'm just going to point you to now. I'm not going to go into mega detail on them, but again, they're explained in more detail with examples in the book. So firstly, we've created a course map view, or if you like, a kind of holistic overview. Remember, I'm using the word course very loosely. So, what contents, what guidance and support is provided, what contents and activities are the students engaged with, what reflection and demonstration and assessment, and how are they communicating in collaboration. So at a quick glance, a designer can make some informed choices about those four things. It's beyond content, it's actually thinking holistically of the four main things that the student needs to, you need to engage for the students. There's a learning outcomes view. Again, you won't be able to see this very well, but the first column there is the learning outcomes. So there's something around research, skills, communication, collaboration and synthesis. The second column is what the students are actually doing, the tasks, and the third are the outputs. Now, any of you who've come across the work of Biggs's constructive alignment will know that he talks of the importance of you have to identify your learning outcomes and make sure they're aligned to your activities and your assessment. So it's just a visual representation of that. Now, in this simple example, you can see that the learning outcome around collaboration is not attached to anything. So either it means we need to put in some activities where the students are collaborating, or we need to take that learning outcome out. Very important. It's something teachers do, but this view makes it more explicit. The next one is what we call the pedagogy profile view, and this gets you a picture of the different kinds of things the students are doing. How much are they reading, viewing, or listening to something? How much are they communicating with others? How much are they interacting with material, for example? And there are a number of categories. What amount of assessment are they engaged with? And it can give you a very rich picture. Often what you find is the first column, to do with reading, viewing and listening, is often too high. Now that may be correct in a poetry class, but may not be great in a chemistry, third level chemistry synthesis class. So it may help the teachers to think, well, I'll take out some of those readings and I'll get the students to go and find things and share and discuss in the forum. The other column that's often very high is assessment. Now, interestingly, these profiles can be used not just by designers, but by learners. And as a learner of Spanish, I did 2 OU courses online. Fantastic courses, really well crafted, great material. But when I did my profile, the lowest column for me was communication. And I can understand Spanish well, my communication is not great. So there are real issues about what the students are gaining, depending on the profile of the activities you get them to engage with. We then have what we affectionately know as our spider diagram, the course dimensions, which takes these 4 higher level things and breaks it down in a little bit. Now, again, you probably can't see this very well, but in this example, there's no student-generated content, very little use of OERs, but lots of multimedia, little communication or peer communication, lots of reflection though. So you can get, and it's quite high in terms of being tutor-guided. So a first-year undergraduate course might be very structured and tutor-guided, whereas a postgraduate course might be much more student-centered. So it gives you a profile which kind of follows on nicely from the course map. And the final view is what we call the task swim lane. And here you list the roles. So we've got the students here, what they're doing. In this case, they're reading instructions, searching the internet, synthesizing and producing a report, and then comparing findings in a forum. The second column lists the resources and tools they're using, and the third shows you what the teacher's doing. So you can see the interrelationship between the tasks, the roles, and the tools and activities. And you can see probably, I hope, how you can oscillate between these. You might just do this very roughly and then go into detail here. You might look at your profile, and that might change the mind of your overall course map, etc. We've used these in lots and lots and lots of workshops, and they do really help to get practitioners to think outside the box, to think beyond content. So, to complement that, and the focus for today in particular, is there have been developed over the last few years a number of visual tools for this. And I can see I've got the wrong version of PowerPoint up, but never mind. So we've got tools like web collage, which Diana's will talk about, the learning designer tool with Yishai will talk about. We've got 5 tools for you to share. But actually also we've taken variants of those and just done them as pen and paper exercises as well in workshops, which has worked equally well. We've got free tools as well, such as FreeMind, for example, for mind mapping. And we've also developed some of these views, like the pedagogy profile, in simple things like Excel. So we're trying to be as accessible as possible. You're going to get a chance to play with some of the tools this afternoon. Some of you will like Compendium, some of you will absolutely hate it, okay? But you might find the notation useful. So, of course, with any tools, there is a time investment to learn them, for example. So it's a question of what's useful for you. We've also been doing a lot of work in terms of collaboration, again going back to this issue of teachers saying, give me examples, give me people to talk to. So we've run lots of different, both real and virtual workshops and events to try and see how we can get teachers to engage and collaborate together. One that we ran, developed at the OU and then was expanded out in a whole range of settings, which was very successful, was called the Design Challenge, which was create a course in a day. So what we did is we've got people working in teams, and there were about 9 teams, and they had a structured day where they started brainstorming the course and the learning outcomes, right through to actually implementing some content in Moodle, our learning management system. And you probably can't see, but around the edge of the room, we had what we called expert stalls. So we had people who were experts in using Second Life, or Web 2 tools, or assessment, or problem-based learning. And at key points in the day, people could run over and get some advice. So at one point, 5 of the teams wanted to know about good, effective ways to support collaborative online assessment. And immediately that team were able to go and grab some guidelines on that. People said it was great, it got them much further in the design process than they thought would be possible. A similar idea that Leicester have run very successfully. Many of you will know Julie Salmon, who was my predecessor at Leicester, and Ali and Simon, for example, are the 2-day Carpe Diem design workshops. Similar kind of idea, but based around the notion of storyboards and the activities. Ali, do you want to say anything more about those?
Yes, I could, but I'm not going to bore people with them. So I just say that it's a heavily storyboard-based approach over 2 days, and that is preceded by a pre-workshop, and then there's a post-workshop session as well. And it's an integrated approach with learning technologists and subject librarians as well as the main course team.
Great, and you've run hundreds of these as well, and evaluated them. Again, if you're interested in that, talk to Ali, he's around for the whole conference. And finally, we've also been experimenting in a number of ways with the ways in which social networking sites can be used. And there are lots of examples where people have been using Elk or Ning before it went private, or Facebook or other spaces. We also created at the OU a space called Cloudworks, which essentially harnesses the best of Web 2 and provides a very valuable space for teachers to be able to share and discuss. The difference between Cloudworks and some of the other social networking sites is it's not egocentric, it's not centred around an individual, it's object-centred. So it's about this notion of mediating artefacts again. So you can set up what are called clouds, which could be anything to do with learning and teaching, and people can share and discuss and augment and improve those clouds. But does it work? Well, in particular, we've had funding through the JISC in the UK and through the EU Leonardo programme for a project called Design Practice, which, as I mentioned, involved Greece and Cyprus. And essentially, with that, we were rolling out this methodology to a whole load of different contexts and people. And going back to the comment at the beginning, this is, in particular, Design Practice was with teacher practitioners. And we've got some really rich data in terms of what is valuable and what works. I'm just going to share 3 quotes. I find the documentation quite thought-provoking, especially as a starting point in this journey for developing good understandings. It's iterative, going back to that iterative, messy, creative process, and so it helps with ironing out any issues. And I could understand the learning design process and would feel able to use this when designing some learning activities. So we've got some really rich positive feedback on the value of these approaches. I should mention this relates to the broader work, as Yishai mentioned at the beginning, the Learning Design Network, Learning Design Grid rather, which has enabled us, those of us who are interested in this area, to come together. Interestingly, it's very European-Australian focused. We don't know why. Learning design seems to be EU and Aussie folk and not the North Americans for some reason. But we are building quite a strong, now I would say, network of learning designers and beginning to fit together the different pieces of the puzzles in terms of what we've been focusing on individually. And it's actually art and science of learning design. As Yishai mentioned, we had an excellent workshop about a month ago where we had, how many people, about 30? 30 people coming together collectively in this area. We've got this workshop, of course, and we're also beginning to talk about whether we can expand this to some form of global network of those interested in learning design. And lots more information on those are on CloudWorks when it's up and running. So just to finish with some questions, and then I think we've got plenty of time for discussion if that's good. This is a bit dense, but I think it kind of gives us an overview of some of what we think are some of the key questions. And these collectively came out of our shared discussions over time, but also in particular the workshop in London just over a month ago. So one of the questions we're interested in, what would a coherent learning design language look like, and how might it be shared? We've developed some mediating artefacts and we've evaluated them, we think they're valuable, but what other ones do we need to develop to help teachers and learners make more effective use of technologies? How can we foster a global network, a community of practice to enable learners and teachers to share? So as I said, when we asked them, they said they wanted to share, they wanted to discuss, and yet somehow it's not happening to the extent we might have hoped. What tools do we need to guide design practice? And Yishai in particular is going to show the learning designer tool that Diana Laurillard and colleagues in the UK have developed, which is much more of a kind of pedagogical planner. It guides you step by step through the stages of design. So it complements, but it's distinct from, I think, some of the visualization tools others of us will produce. What are the implications of new technologies and how can we harness them better? What are the impact of emergent technologies? If we look at the Horizon report, within a 1-year time frame they talk about the impact of e-books, 3 years they talk about gesture and haptic technologies and augmented learning, and 5 years they talk about learning analytics, the way in which we can harvest the rich data under the bonnet of our learning management systems. What new pedagogies are we seeing? So people like George Siemens, for example, in Canada, argues that in addition to things like associative behaviourist, constructivist and socially situated pedagogies, we're now seeing the emergence of what he calls connectivist pedagogies. Now again, the term is contentious, but he would argue there's something distinct and different about interacting in this global network that we're now part of. And what are the implications for both learners, teachers and institutions of these new kinds of media? How will the process of supporting learning, design, delivery, support and assessment change as a result of these new technologies? What social inclusion and exclusion issues are happening? I'm just in the process of editing a special issue for distance education on this issue of social inclusion and exclusion. Because I would argue, although the digital divide is narrower, it's deeper, and there are some real issues about people who are not able to engage with these new technologies. How are OER being designed, used and repurposed? And what are the implications for formal institutions when we've got a plethora of new free resources, tools and even courses? So we've got this notion of massive online open courses which are completely free. So the nature of traditional institutions are changing as a result of these new technologies, and we need to take account of that. I don't think it means institutions will go away, but I think the way in which we provide and support students will change. What digital literacy skills will both learners and teachers need? How the ways in which we communicate and collaborate change. How many of you would say the way in which you go about your daily practice, whether it's teaching or research, how many of you say it's fundamentally changed in the last 5-10 years or so? Only a few of you. In what way, Simon?
I'm far more engaged with peers and colleagues than I ever was before, and also getting used to the new platforms that we're using every day. But I think it's probably another thing is finding information, finding research, journals and articles and so on. I think it's changed hugely.
I think I mentioned this to some people before. As part of the book, I was trying to find a reference from 1972 by Kay. It was a very well referenced conference proceedings, and I had all the information apart from the dates. I'm trying to be rigorous with the book and make the references proper. couldn't find it anywhere. I spent hours and hours on Google, and loads of people were referencing this thing, and nobody had the dates of the darn conference. So eventually, in desperation, I tweeted it, and I got 5 replies in 5 minutes giving me exactly what the reference was. Now that's amazingly powerful. And the way in which, if you're part of this global network, you can send out information. Lots of us are tweeting here in terms of what's happening at conferences like this, or the latest blogs, or references, or what have you. So I think there are profound changes in the way we do things as a result of these technologies. How can we create more effective environments to promote the use of these technologies? And how can informal learning using OER be assessed and accredited? Interestingly, there are 2 new models emerging there. Some of you will have heard of the peer-to-peer university, which now has a peer-reviewed badging scheme for referencing and recognising competences of learners. And the second model is the OER University, led by Wayne McIntosh in New Zealand, where there's a global consortium of international institutions. Students can choose to learn anywhere they want with any materials, and then they just come to the association and get accredited through that institution. So quite interesting, different business models there. And finally, what kind of policy directives do we need to have in place to promote these things, and what new methodologies and theoretical perspectives will we need to address these really quite complex research questions in the future? So as I mentioned, if you're interested in the kind of more detailed, substantive background to that, I've got draft chapters of the book online. You're very welcome to have access to them. Don't buy the book, it's going to cost a fortune and it's going to be hardback. Don't tell Springer I said that. And if you'd like access, just...
Springer editor is there.
erase that bit. I love you, Springer. So that's me dead. So that's my email address. If you'd like access to that, I'd be very happy to give you access and really welcome comments. So I think that's left us nicely lots of time for discussions. And should we just open it up for, should we just have any clarifications first, and then thoughts, comments, or other questions you'd like to ask, either me or any of the rest of the team? Yeah?
Perhaps a bit of an obvious one, because you started the presentation with a remark that there is a lot of free material out there, good material, but it's not being used. I was surprised to not see it back in the questions, which were in a sense challenging, because a lot of things were responding to new environments, new opportunities. But I think getting the material really used by practitioners is the main challenge.
Absolutely, and I thought it wasn't there as a question, but it's not. It certainly should be. Absolutely, because that is key. You know, there are fantastic resources out there, and interesting, I've done exercises with teachers. I've said, just give me good examples in my subject area, and I've given